what I think is also really interesting, and this is something that was brought up in an article that was done on the docuseries, is that there has been several movies, right, where the focus and kind of one of the protagonists has been Boston and like this white tough guy kind of, appeal. So whether it's, what is it, Matt Damon and Ben Affleck in several movies that they have done, or others, Departed. There is this I don't know what you call it, white tough guy nostalgia or fairy tale that Hollywood has created around the city. What do you make of that in relationship to the reality that you just spoke of that had stamped this city in a way for racial intolerance?
Well, I mean, obviously it's really distorted because it ignores half the city, more than half of the city. Yeah, and there is this sort of romantic idea of Boston and the gangs and Whitey Bulger, who was this big gangster and all of that. I mean, the character Jack Nicholson plays in The Departed is essentially Whitey, without the Boston accent. And yeah, there's been this huge romanticism of, the Irish gangs, the Italian mob, and so on. And it, much to the city's detriment. And it completely ignores, the experience so many Black people have had in this city. Kind of drives me crazy that that's what people think of as Boston, because there's so much more of Boston.
And Danielle makes a good point. When I was there in Boston last year was a book fair, and there was a Black author who says, I grew up in this city. I'm as Boston as anyone else. But when they think of Boston, they think exactly what you said. Matt Damon, Mark Wahlberg, The Departed, Irish cops. And he says, let me tell you my story. I love the Celtics. I'm a Bostonian. But at the same time, I could tell you stories where I had to duck out of certain neighborhoods because I'm Black. Right. So Boston, even now, for some Black folks, has always been this way, where we're here, we're Bostonian, we cheer for the sports, but a part of the city says you don't belong. You're not part of the narrative. And I mean,
look, when I moved here in 1989, I was told, don't go to South Boston, don't go to Charlestown. Hyde Park is iffy. And, coming from Miami, where I'd grown up, the idea that there were whole parts of the city that I wasn't supposed to set foot in was just mind-boggling to me. And it was true in Boston for a long time. I mean, you mentioned busing. There were a handful of Black families in places like South Boston and Charlestown when busing started. They all had to bail. And there weren't any Black residents again for 20 years. I mean, that's part of Boston's history.
And so it's a thing where I see, which is, sadly, we're talking about the story that took place in 1989. We're talking about the exonerated five again, 80s in New York. I'm old enough to remember the atrocious Willie Horton campaign that sunk Michael Dukakis's pretty much his presidential campaign, right? Like it got the elder Bush elected. And for those who are youngins, go back and check it out. It was a deliberately race baiting, terrible, just terrible ad that preyed on white fear that there's a released Black criminal, and once he was released, he committed more crimes. And specifically, Michael Dukakis won't be tough on crime. Now, I say this in the context of the upcoming 2024 election, where, if you all have been paying attention, inner city crime, migrants, right? And Tucker Carlson just said that, compared to these other cities, Moscow is the safest city. It's safer.
I mean, that's his city. So.
Yeah. And so I see, Adrian, like a repeat, maybe not just a repeat, not even a remake, like a reboot. It's the reboot of the same narrative again and again. Invaders, criminals, rapists, Muslims, Black threat, inner city. And I'm sitting here thinking to myself, we have the history. We see the damage that is done to communities in Boston, in New York. Why don't we learn?
That's a great question. And it's one of the reasons really I wanted to do this story, because we bury this history and we need to stop burying it. We need to come and confront it and live with it. And you're right. You do see a lot of parallels here. You do see those same notes getting struck again. You see it in the migrant debate, right? They're up in arms about migrants in places that don't even have any migrants. Mm-hmm. I watch people in New Hampshire who are like crazed about migrants, and I'm like, What migrants? There's no migrants in Nashua, New Hampshire. Like none. Why do you care? But that whole idea of demonizing other people, I mean, it's baked into this country. It really is.
Adrian, how do you think, you address the fact that during the time that this story was unfolding, that cable news was not a thing, social media was not a thing. Now it is very much a part of our day-to-day lives. How do you think that these kinds of stories, which continue to still happen, unfortunately, how social media, does it help us in bringing a different light because people have access to places where only 3 news stations would give them access in the late 80s and the 90s? Does it aid, I guess, in the kind of catch fire that took place with this story, that everyone ran with it? Or like, how do you think that in today, 30 years later, these kinds of stories play out or would play out?
I think it would play out differently now because of social media. And the difference, I think the people saying, the skeptics, the people saying, I'm not sure the story makes sense. Why were they there in the first place? All that kind of stuff. They would have a place to go now, They have megaphones now. They have podcasts now, for example. And I think, so I think in that sense, it would play out a lot differently. At least I'd like to think so.
Yeah, but I also am thinking about, and maybe this is me being the cynic, with social media, and as we have seen the violence against Black folks, that Marine who choked out that man on the subway, killed him, and we see Kyle Rittenhouse, who it was at a BLM protest, but he killed and shot 2 white folks and is seen as the hero. I'm wondering whether or not, if this murderer played his tune, if you will, to right-wing media, they would run with Camelot couple. It's very interesting. Like, I see the parallels, and I also do want to focus on this fact because I don't want to give a spoiler alert, but there was real damage. Like, they arrested the wrong guy. Can you tell us about the family that got destroyed, the community that got actually destroyed as a result of this media sensationalization?
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, I don't want to sound like a Pollyanna here. God knows we all know social media is a giant mixed bag. But to your question, there were 2 Black men who were ultimately named publicly as suspects, Alan Swanson and later Willie Bennett. And and I mean, they were dragged through the mud. They ultimately weren't charged with the crime because there was no evidence against them whatsoever. But it did a tremendous amount of damage to them and to their families and to the neighborhood around them. Absolutely.
I also, one of the things that are highlighted too is the mayor's actions in the beginning. Forgive me because I can't remember the name.
Ray Flynn.
Rafe. Okay. So he is he's being told, why don't you slow down a bit, right? In the way that you're like hitting the ground running, just following what this man is saying, what Charles is saying, that doesn't make sense. It's not adding up. And like, if you pause for a second, and he refused. Can you talk to us about like the politics of that moment? Like, you have, from the president on down, talking about this war on drugs, talking about this war in the urban cities. And is it the pressure that the mayor is feeling like, I gotta act, so it doesn't matter like whether or not I have all the facts, because I just have to act so that I don't look weak? Like, what is in your mind throughout this investigation? What is coming into play for him?
I think that in the heat of the moment, it seemed like such a shocking crime. He felt that, they had to get somebody arrested right away. They had to solve this murder right away. He holds a press conference the night of the shooting outside the hospital where Carol Stewart is being treated, and says, we're going to assign every single available detective in this case. And the interesting thing about that is, this is a time when a lot of people are getting shot in Boston. Murders are not uncommon, and nobody was typically holding press conferences saying, we're putting everybody we got on this one, So right from the beginning, it was treated as this extraordinary thing. It really fed the hysteria. And I think he had no control, which he should have had, over what the police department was doing, or didn't exercise any control. Let me put it that way. Mm-hmm, and by the way, I sought to interview Mayor Flynn, of course, for the piece. and he declined to talk about it. He's 84 now and has
Mm.
basically stopped doing interviews.